And I'll now ask Inka to talk about obtaining consent in the life sciences. Inka, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. Let me just do that. Can you all see that?
Yes, that's up and running in your sound.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Inka Nitka. I'm a professor of epithelial biology, so I'm a life scientist, but I'm also the interim dean of the School of Life Science in Dundee. And I also take great interest, and I've been very active in particularly research integrity and setting up a research ethics committee in the school. And what I was going to do today is just go through some of the practices we have in place in life sciences for sort of traditional projects, but also some that are maybe not unique to us, but that warrant consideration in this context, and share with you how we do that and how consent figures into this. And Margaret's already introduced the whole concept very well, and I just wanted to just reiterate that the issues that come up around consent and ethics consideration for research project in life sciences are really no different than those in medicines, except that participants are usually not patients, in fact, and I'll go through how we differentiate that, because they are really governed by a separate ethics body, but they can be anything. They're usually not clinical research, but research projects. So can go from people who provide information, people who give blood samples, and anything in between. And of course, as for clinical research, in anybody who participates in research as not really even necessarily a subject, but somebody who participates and gives information, they need to know what kind of procedures or things they're exposed to. They need to understand the risks and benefits, be offered alternatives in case there are special needs, know about risks and benefits of the alternatives, and also have a real good assessment of all these elements. So we need to, the people collecting the consent need to make sure that the people they collect the consent from have understood all these things. And again, as Margaret already alluded to, there are loads of incredibly useful guidance documents that many institutions and many people use. And so there's quite a lot of commonality. So we all work from the same principles. And again, this is just to reiterate, why do we collect informed consent? It's so the participants know what they're signed up for, and that makes our research much more effective. It makes sure the research that's conducted is ethical, and we comply with the data protection law and others. And of course, it's incredibly important to do this before one does anything. In fact, while one thinks about starting a study, as again, I think this is just, I really like this. He says, wake him up, we need informed consent for the next part. That's not very helpful, and it certainly doesn't make for very good research. One doesn't think about these things beforehand. Yeah. So again, this is just, and most of this is reiterated, but I think it's really important that consent doesn't just include understanding all these things, what kind of data we're collecting, what will happen, how are we going to use the results of the research we do, how we share them, what are we going to do with the data. And again, this is really important. Again, just as in medical research, participation is voluntary, and our consent form, just as others, make it very clear how, if participants choose to withdraw, how they can do that. And that they can do it, how their data will be handled, how long it will be kept, what their rights are. If there are procedures, is this being observed? Who's going to be watching this? How is this being recorded? And also, who's responsible for the data? Again, Margaret mentioned the data controller, so they know who to contact if they have any issues. So what I'm now sharing with you is some of the procedures we have in place, which I will use as examples of how consent is involved and what we do at the university. So all these images that you see that look like this are screenshots from our websites, where we try in very clear language to describe how do we do things. We have links to the relevant forms, to the committees, so that people can get as much information, not just when they want to conduct studies, but also participants can, of course, do this. So because we're a large university and we have 10 different schools, we currently have individual school research ethics committee, they're called SRECs, and they review the cases for ethical review that come from within that school. And they are supervised and overseen by the university research ethics committee, who acts as the overseeing body. And this establishes that there is school-specific and area-specific expertise around. You see there are 6 schools. In fact, we have 10 schools, but that's because many schools are quite small and they work together, and that works quite well. So the University Research Ethics Committee provides the oversight. And the process basically follows something that the Economic and Social Research Council outlined in one of their very helpful diagrams that I'm just, again, the details aren't so important, but it's just the principle. The first question that always gets asked and really see, is what you're doing research? And if it isn't, then ethical approval is likely not necessary. And then if it is research, then does it actually require ethics? What are the criteria? And then there are specific questions to establish that. Is it high risk, low risk? Is it actually more medical research? Is it relating to NHS patients? And in Dundee, we have the Tayside Medical Science Centre that deals with all clinical ethical approval. But again, if people don't know up front, there's a process to establish that. And again, going back to our websites, there are these checklists that we've tried to keep very simple, because even though collectively there's a lot of knowledge, as people embark on this process, individually there isn't always so much. So having a very clear process that guides people through with simple, clear questions to help establish these criteria and what exactly needs to be done helps by having these processes very well outlined. So after establishing something's research, how do we establish whether it actually does require ethical approval? And here's just again an example. These are the kinds of questions we're asking to help people identify whether they're, or determine whether they're, where their proposed project sits within this arena. And if any of these questions have a yes answer, the conclusion is very simple: ethical approval is required and they have to proceed. Another really important thing to remember here, and again, Margaret alluded to this, even if formally by these criteria established, which abide with all the principle that Margaret alluded to, if it doesn't formally require ethical approval, one might still wish to seek formal approval from a relevant school research ethics committee if one wishes to publish it, because some journals may have specific requirements in this space. So I think this is always something that's really important, particularly in life sciences space, to consider. And I already mentioned this, is the research something related to healthcare? So is it involving the NHS? Because if it does, then it needs to go to a specifically dedicated team of experts in that case. And I'm not going to deal with that so much because I sit in the life sciences space and we are looking at projects where this isn't the case for the most part. And this is just explaining what the Tayside Medical Center deals with. So we have a whole slew of documents. So these are some of these I mentioned. There's guidance documents, there are risk assessment, but not just for the application process. And I'm going to just mention this briefly. If a research project involves the use of human tissue from healthy volunteers, we have a tissue bank or a Tayside tissue depository that collects tissue, and there are direct applications possible to that group that do not require a specific ethical procedure because they have already been ethically approved for tissue research of specific type, and that goes directly there. So these procedures tend to be for other projects, but not only for the application process, but also for the people on the research ethics committees, particularly looking again at consent. There are reviewers' checklists to help people who are coming into this sphere, who act on these committees, to review these in a consistent and knowledgeable way. And that helps us have the collective knowledge across the university consistent. There are, of course, appeals procedures and all kinds of other things. And there are templates for both information, for sheet templates for participants that can be edited according to the projects, but also for consent forms that take into account the requirements that we've already heard about. And I wanted to just highlight a couple of areas that we have been trying to revise in our code of practice more recently. And that pertains to research that might be conducted overseas. And again, Margaret already very helpfully alluded to some of this, and also research involving social media. And these are things we've more recently included in our guidance. What do we do when samples or data that involves human volunteers to be used are generated in countries other than the UK? And ideally, of course, we want to obtain we want to operate under exactly the same guidance and the same rules and regulations that we have, and confirm that the ethical standards that were used or are being used in these type of research are on par with ours, particularly when it comes to consent. But sometimes it turns out, in my experience, that can be difficult because, for instance, if one wants to collect particular information from people that live in countries where the language is not very common and we can't get it translated. So there may have been a consent procedures, but knowing whether that's the case is really difficult because the language is not something that we can have translated readily. I mean, it sounds obscure, but I have been a part of these, and then finding people who can help us establish that the consent was obtained to our norms and regulation is sometimes tricky. Or if that's not the issue, but actually the way consent forms were designed are not completely adequate by our standards, or don't comply with our standards. Or if the provenance of data or samples isn't clear, if documents are not available or only partial. My recommendation to people is always, if any of these issues arise, I would be very wary of using samples like this, and try to either see if I can get them elsewhere, or if I can design my own study locally, but sometimes that's not possible. And so that may be, again, this has to be decided on a case-by-case basis, but obviously we don't want to have a case where we are not sure whether ethical approval and consent has been obtained properly. And the other thing, again, is really important to remember, if one wants to publish data, there has to be an ability to demonstrate that UK standards of ethics, and particularly of seeking consent, have been established. We already discussed this a bit previously. Social media, secondary data. Again, it's really important to remember, and this is something we've now included in our guidelines, data available that are we don't know how the consent has been obtained for the data that's available, and we can't always assume that secondary data will have the appropriate consent for potential new uses of the data for research purposes. Again, that's why it's really important to establish what one can if one wants to use such data, and that these requirements, not minimum, that have been met, and that's not always so easy. So using this data for even also for life sciences purposes is not without its risk. And I wanted to, in the last few minutes, just describe some projects that we are involved in that maybe people are not always so think of when it comes to consent. And that relates to an activity that in life sciences we take very seriously, and that's public engagement. And our undergraduate project, undergraduate students have the opportunity to engage and learn about public engagement and undertake a public engagement project. And that usually goes a bit like this. The students learn about particular scientific principles or ideas, and then they design an engagement project to educate usually a specific target group, it's usually not a scientific group, about this particular issue. It could be a new drug that's been designed, or a process for drug design, or a disease where we've learned certain behaviors are better, or just a disease that is commonly misunderstood, and so on. There are lots of different examples. The students then, once they've learned about this and demonstrate their scientific knowledge, they design an activity to achieve this education. But But of course, in order to measure the effectiveness of such an activities, they have to conduct surveys before and after to see, is the activity they've designed effective at conveying the information they wish. And then that involves collecting feedback or information from participants. And usually in this case, personal data is not collected in terms of identity of people, but some characteristics might be collected. For instance, I had a student who wanted to inform about a particular signaling pathway and how understanding this pathway has allowed particular drugs to be developed. So this whole basic research and the process of translation. She designed a board game that people could play to really understand the different parts of the puzzle that had to come together for this process to work. So she shared her knowledge with the participants. In this case, they were non-scientists, the general public, but she wanted to know if there was a difference between people and that were trained up to a certain level in science or not at all, or had a college degree or not. So she had to collect that information. And then she could assess the effectiveness of this activity by evaluating her data and could compare if there was a difference. And this, of course, also requires consent from the participants to make sure they agree with participating. And even though there's no risk to them physically, but they are still giving up their time and their information, at least their response to this activity, is recorded. And we have a lot of these projects, and they all require a low risk, but they require ethical consideration and consent from participants. So in order to because we have about between 20 and 40 students who undertake these different projects every year, we've added something to our process, and that's a guidance for a module level and group applications can be processed. So we don't have to do this 30 times but we can do this in a collective way where the consent forms, where the ethical considerations that pertain to such projects can be dealt with collectively to help the workload that's associated and also streamline them in this process. And then in order for such a module group level approval to exist, there are various criteria that make sure that they meet the proper standards, and they can only be active for a maximum of 3 years unless there are substantial changes, at which point they have to be edited again. So I think this brings me to the end, and I'm happy to entertain questions about more specifics, but just to close, obviously, when we deal with students who are underage, and they are part of these groups that we use for our public engagement projects, which we do, there are clearly additional risk assessments and other criteria we may have to include depending on the age of the participants or any other protected characteristics we might have to deal with. And I think that was all I want to say for now. I hope that helps a bit, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Inka, thank you very much. That's fascinating. We've already had some questions coming in, so if we'll go those. We've got about 15 minutes of questions. Go on, so please do put them in, and please do use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Okay, Damien asks, do you think the question, is it research in the ESLC flowchart is helpful? What about undergraduate and postgraduate models that train students in research methods, as they'll be doing data collection, working with participants needing consent, but they're not defined necessarily as doing research? Would they not need some form of approval or oversight?
Well, I think if there's data collection involved, then that would be research. If there's data collection involved from people, from participants, if it's just from the literature, it's different. So we do have guidelines on what constitutes research. So, and these honors projects will do some, well, so I think, is it research and is helpful? If it's just research methods, I think it depends on what research it is. If it's just collecting information like published literature and that's the type of research, obviously not. If research involves participants whom we collect information from, then I would imagine so, yes. So it depends on the detail.
Thank you. Ned asks, with the public engagement projects, is there not an argument this is not research, as it's not being generalizable, or transferable? Could public engagement projects be legitimately regarded as evaluation of teaching?
We don't think so, because we involve participants who we collect some information about. It's low risk, and we have these group application, but I still think it's much better to make it very clear and regard it as research. And because the data that is collected is presented back as data, that's a really important part of these projects.
Thank you. Gavin asked about international differences in consenting standards. Is there a risk of research in some countries becoming an area of poor practices because ethical standards can vary so much? Do you think that unethical researchers might choose to base projects in certain countries to evade rigorous scrutiny?
Well, I would hope not, but that's why I made that point, is if research is done in a different country, for instance, in tropical diseases, we don't have them here. So some of the research is being done elsewhere, even if it's interventions or screening or things like that. And that's why it's very important to investigate and to ask for documentation of the ethical standards that were in place before accepting such data. That is exactly what we're trying to do.
Thank you.
So I would hope that isn't an option.
Yeah. What's your view on if someone has already collected data that they later wish to use in a research project? What's your view about consent in those circumstances? The example given by the questioner is, say, someone has video recordings from a CCTV camera already and then wishes to use that recording in some form of research project, say of people's comings and goings. How would they go around seeking consent in that situation? That may not be particularly relevant to your discipline, so we may ask for other people's views. We may ask David's views later.
As you can see, I'm a little bit, my gut feeling is that if you use data that pertains to people's behavior, what they've done, and there's I would always wish I really don't know. I think Margaret might know better. I mean, this is not a clinical intervention, this is observation.
I think
makes me really uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think we may put that to the social scientists later. It can be quite challenging. We've had at UK Rare inquiries to say people who had gathered data through working in a professional capacity, say as a lawyer or as a journalist or whatever, and basically then moved to academia and had these interesting data sets and said, can I use them in research? And often the answer was no, because the data gathering met the standards of your previous profession, but not the different standards of academia. However, the data could be used perhaps to inspire future research. It's a very interesting question. Maris, we'll try and address that question later in the session. Okay, Shirley asks, would you consider a student single participant case study as research? The participant would be sharing personal and sensitive data. Would GDPR compliance be enough here, or should it go through some form of research ethics review?
I always think it's better to be safe than sorry, but I don't know the legal background sufficiently to know the right answer to that. But I think it never hurts to go to the ethics committee and ask them, and then they can discuss it, and then you've done due diligence.
Yes, always worth asking people in your institution if you're not sure. Thank you very much.
And also remember, journals may have specific rules about that, and that's not a bad place to also look if you're completely unsure. But I think one's own institution, and I think it's always better to be super safe, particularly, it's about protecting people and doing the right thing. And so I think it's better to err on the side of being too cautious.
Thank you. One question that's come up is that because of the very challenging circumstances in which we find ourselves living, and because infection control measures can vary, planned research, for example, that is going to rely on, say, face-to-face interviews or potentially even traveling to another country may suddenly become no longer possible. Is it best practice to sort of plan ahead when considering your consent documentation to say, ideally, we will collect data this way, but it might be that way? Or is it a case of seeking consent for one form of data collection and then simply following up with supplemental requests if circumstances change? What do you think? Is there a right answer out of those two approaches?
I think it's, if you know it's a possibility, then to me it would be much easier to put it in. One could almost have a flow chart and saying, you know, this is ideally what we want to do, this is a possibility, and this is how we would mitigate things that might then crop up. I always think that this, first of all, it's easier for the committee to see the whole case and saying, and then considering that, and then they can come back and say, actually, we don't think this bit's going to work because of this, you have to add this in, and then you've done it rather than having to wait. Often when we run these projects, people, you know, it takes time. So I would always, if you know it's a possibility, I always think it's good to put it in.
Thank you, that's really helpful. A question: if you're traveling to another country to conduct your research with human participants, should you look to involve a local researcher in the study to ensure local considerations and cultural aspects are observed? And should you seek ethical approval from a REC in that country also?
I would say yes to all of that, if you can, if that's possible. Because, as you know, consent is not just about protecting the person, but by doing so, one also makes sure the research is as good as it can be, and having considerations for cultural differences, particularly if it's if the research involves, for instance, responding to particular interventions, verbal interventions, or things like that, then it's really important to understand that. And I'm sure David will also go into that. So I think if that would always be good, but I think we need to, we need to make sure the ethical standards are up to our level. But having, also there may be local reasons that, and if that's the case, understanding those and knowing what those are is then helpful if one has to somehow address something that one wasn't prepared for.
That's brilliant, thank you. We've had a lot of questions throughout on issues of consent regarding vulnerable persons and children. Are there particular issues which you feel are relevant to obtaining consent regarding children, child research participants in the life sciences? Is there particular good practice that you feel should be championed, or particular pitfalls that you think people should be very wary of?
The only projects where I'm aware that in life sciences, in our school at least, children might be involved are these public engagement projects. And I think there, we don't, it's the usual risk assessment, so I can't really comment. One thing, I just had this thought. One thing that we do sometimes, that it's not directly related, but something that we look at very carefully, and again, Margaret mentioned coercion. When we want to collect, let's just say, just healthy blood for a very little bit, and we can do that for particular research projects. Sometimes the person acting as a participant, being as a participant, is an employee. It might be a subordinate to the person conducting the research. And we always, as a research ethics committee, look very carefully how consent, how withdrawing, and all those things are in place, how that's handled, to make sure that there's no indication of that. So this is not children, but these are people who could be considered dependents. And I'm always very uncomfortable about that, which is why we look very carefully at those relationships. It's slightly different, but I don't have experience other than in these public engagement activities where it's really watching and monitoring reactions and collecting feedback, and where children are involved.
Thank you. That's right. I think it's very sensible to be wary of power relationships and hierarchies. I mean, as someone who was an undergraduate many, many years ago, the amount of people I knew in other disciplines who in their first week of university were told by their tutor, congratulations, a participant in my research project, went off the rails. I'd like to think things have got better since then. We have a question from a number of questions about international research. Mm-hmm. If I'm doing the research, if my research participants from multiple countries, so outside of the UK, what should be the procedure there if I'm dealing with research participants in multiple non-UK countries? That's a very open question. So I just, from the perspective of your discipline only, would anybody
I would use the same. I mean, I think one thing is to use the same consent, we're talking about consent, the same ethical standards that we use here, if that's at all possible. I mean, I think each case, it depends a little. I mean, that would be the bottom line. If it, but I'm sure we could make up examples where when that might be impossible for some reason or another, but I really can't think about that now. But I think that should always be the aim. That would be again, Margaret may have, she's probably much more knowledgeable in the legal background and I thought it was very helpful that there are universally accepted standards in this space that we should apply. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. I should say to everyone, we will have a bit of time at the end after David's presentation and Q&A session are finished. And what we may do then is try, if we have time, bring in all three speakers to sort of consider some of these questions. I think it's particularly interesting thinking about how different models of good practice in obtaining consent can sometimes not necessarily clash but overlap in that what is traditionally done in one discipline may be quite different from another discipline. In medicine, for example, and the life science, all about informed consent in advance, whereas in the social sciences, for example, you can sometimes do covert research, which is tiny regulation, there are rules, but that's about seeking consent sometimes after the fact. So I think multidisciplinary projects present huge challenges in terms of how different, let's call it, traditions of consent can be made to work well together, and how researchers need to effectively. Sorry, that motorbike outside. It could be worse. The last webinar we did, I had people doing building works across the road, and also there's as much noise there. But how researchers need to be open to working with people who work according to quite different models of good practice, but it is still good practice. It just seems very alien to them. Now, enough from me. Let's get back to some questions. Okay. There's an interesting one about how we train people to be researchers. Helen asked the question, should university undergraduate students be sort of required to engage in research as part of their degree to carry, to learn skills, etc.? I'd just be interested to get your thoughts on that. Well,
we do. I mean, this is one of the things we offer, that, a research project, an honors project, where they do some kind of research, and even in, I'm not trying to make them sound less, but even in our public engagement projects, collecting data and doing a piece of research, for instance, looking at responses before and after an intervention or an education process, is part of that. And doing that ethically, getting consent, is part of the process so that they learn. We also deliver, certainly in our master's research project programs, we have doing of research data. How do we do that in ethics and research integrity is a really important part of the training we have. We actually demand from all our undergraduates to do a research integrity training online module, and that includes ethics procedures and things like that. So we try to make sure that whether they do a hands-on laboratory research project, a public engagement project, a literature project, all the students, undergraduates and taught postgraduates and PhDs doing their induction, get training and introduction to these concepts, and get pointed to where the relevant information is. So I think it's really important. And not just they, but also our staff. We have open sessions about these things.
Thank you, it's very helpful. A follow-up question from Claire. In your university, are undergraduates allowed to seek and take consent from research participants, or is it done, are they sort of trained on how it should work, but it's done, someone else has sort of responsibility for obtaining consent or supervising?
I think they're supervised. They themselves are part of the process, but they're supervised. And any of the applications that come from undergraduates always have to have the involvement of a supervisor, but they are part of the process, and they are part of the consent taking process under supervision.